A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Thank you so much for tuning in to another edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company. My name is Cam Edwards. I am not having a great day, to be quite honest with you. Still reeling from the election results in Virginia on Tuesday night. We will talk about this in just a moment with Dave Adams, who is the Legislative Affairs Director for the Virginia Shooting Sports Association. And we will talk about what is coming down the pike for gun owners in Virginia. And I got to tell you, gun owners around the country, you better beware, because gun control advocates think that they have a winning playbook here, and they are going to try to take it perhaps to your state in the 2020 presidential election. So let's talk a little bit about what happened last night around the country in terms of our Second Amendment votes. I called it an Eastwood election, meaning we've got the good, the bad, and the ugly to talk about. The good in Mississippi, where Tate Reeves won election as governor of Mississippi. That is good news. Jim Hood, the Democrat Attorney General, had been running as a pro-gun guy, and he'd actually been okay in the past, but he really had objections to castle doctrine language, and he will not be the first Democrat in 16 years to lead the state of Mississippi. Now, the bad is up in Kentucky, where Governor Matt Bevin, right now refusing to concede. He is down by about 4,000 votes out of more than 1.4 million cast. So this was a close election. Matt Bevin, actually the only Republican right now to lose in the state of Kentucky last night. You have a brand new Republican Attorney General, Daniel Cameron, and I think that gun owners can look forward to seeing the Kentucky Attorney General sign on to some amicus briefs, front of the court briefs, arguments to the Supreme Court and other courts around the country to take up Second Amendment cases and decide in favor of the right to keep and bear arms. A couple of state legislative races in Kentucky also went to pro-gun candidates, Republicans in both cases. Governor Matt Bevin, one of the nation's most unpopular governors in terms of his polling numbers. And again, even he almost managed to eke out a win. We'll see if this goes to a recount. The Libertarian candidate, playing the role of spoiler there, get about 28,000 votes, which was about 6 times the margin of victory for Andy Beshear, the Democrat Attorney General of Kentucky, who right now, it looks like, is going to be the new governor there in the state. And then we have Virginia, where it looks like Democrats are going to have a 21-19 majority in the state Senate, a 1-vote majority in the state Senate. Perhaps as easier, perhaps as much as a 10-vote majority in the House of Delegates. Looks like it's going to be 55-45 in the House. And I got to tell you, gun owners, we're gonna be faced with the biggest challenge that we in the state have ever faced. It's been 26 years since there's been full and complete control of the levers of government in Virginia by anti-gun Democrats. And this time around, looks like we're going to see some pretty restrictive items get thrown at us pretty quickly. That's why I wanted to bring in Legislative Affairs Director of the Virginia Shooting Sports Association, Dave Adams, to talk about what we can expect, what happened on Election Day, and where gun owners and Virginians go from here. Take a look and a listen. Well, Dave, thank you so much for coming on the program, sir. It is good talking to you on a very gloomy Wednesday, I think, for gun owners, not only in Virginia, but across the nation.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Cam. I think you're right. It's going to take a lot of work going forward after what happened last night.
So let's talk first of all about how this election shook out. It looks like it's going to be 21-19 Democrats controlling the Senate, perhaps 55-45 in the House of Delegates. Gun control groups, they spent millions of dollars targeting a lot of suburban districts. They did not get every one of their objectives. Kurt Cox was reelected, outgoing Speaker of the House. Over on the Senate side, Tommy Norman, Senate Majority Leader, winning reelection. I got to tell you, Dave, I mean, where I lived, My Republican delegate and state senator got reelected with, I think, maybe their biggest majorities. I mean, it was well into the 60s for their reelection bids. What happened last night to flip the legislature in Virginia?
There was a couple things. I think turnout, once again, like we saw in 2017, ever since President Trump won in 2016, there's been a concerted effort to turn out folks that they did not think turned out to vote in 2016. You also had added to that 11 House districts were redrawn by the court after a group of Democrats challenged the House redistricting from 2013, on gerrymandering, racial gerrymandering basis. And when the Republicans and the governor could not come to a decision on a new redistricting plan, it was thrown into the courts. They redrew 11 districts, and some of those really changed. Kirk Cox was one of them. They basically rotated it at a 45-degree angle from what it was, and it went from being a 62% plus Republican district to a 49% Republican district. Yet, he didn't abandon his base. He came out there and campaigned on what he had done for his district and for the people of Virginia, and he won by 5 percentage points. On the other hand, over in the Senate, you had Glenn Sturtevant, who won thanks to gun owners 4 years ago. This year, you really didn't know what he stood for. He pretty much abandoned his base. He was worried that because a lot of his district was suburban, that he had to talk about things that he thought they would be supportive of without supporting his base at the same time to get them energized to vote. And in the end, he lost by almost 10 percentage points. The opposite of that in the state Senate was Amanda Chase. Amanda Chase had been hounded by the Richmond Times-Dispatch for an incident that was alleged to have occurred down at the General Assembly related to where she was parking and some things that was alleged to have been said to some Capitol Police. And then you had a group called Fund Her Virginia, a PAC, came in and attacked her, Glenn Sturtevant, and Sobin Durnovant, who was in Henrico County, senator in Henrico County. And in the end, she stood firm. She did not shirk from her pro-gun stance. She went on. She was out there. She was forceful about what she had done and what she believed in, and she won by 10 percentage points. And I mean, they threw everything at that woman, and she won by 10 percentage points. So I think that the lesson that we take from this is that A, you got to turn your people out, and B, you stand up for what you believe in, and you don't try to stick your finger up in the air and see which way the polls are run.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I know that I've seen a lot of folks say today, well, look, Virginia's solidly blue. I don't, I'm sorry, Dave, maybe this is just, me being a hopeless optimist, but I don't believe that's the case, honestly. I mean, when you look at some of these races, particularly in the House side, it looks like it's going to be a comfortable win for Democrats, but some of the margins there, I mean, you're almost looking at, a 50-50 vote in a number of these districts. And so I think you're right. I think it does come down to turnout. I think a lot of these races did involve individuals who went a little squishy and thought that the way to win votes was to try to, quote unquote, moderate their views. But it really sounded like they were becoming, a less of the type of politician that they might have, been when they ran for election 2 years earlier. And I think that does have an impact on voters. But now we get to the reality that Democrats are in complete control of Virginia government. And I hate to keep talking about it in terms of Democrat versus Republican, Dave, because the right to keep bear arms is a nonpartisan right. It is a right of the left. It's of the right, a right of the right and of the middle. But unfortunately, we have a lot of anti-gun politicians with D's behind their name in charge of government, from the governor to the attorney general to the legislature. And we know that Governor Ralph Northam has called for a, quote unquote, assault weapons ban, a magazine ban, the return of one gun a month. What are some of the bills that you think we are likely to see when the new legislative session begins in January?
Oh, I think that you've pretty much named some that we're going to see at the top of the list. I do know that one Democrat member of the House of Delegates that was reelected last night, Danica Rome, said we're definitely going to get universal background checks. You'll see the so-called assault weapons ban. What version of that you see introduced is anyone's guess. If you go with what the governor put out at the beginning of the session last year, that would have encompassed every semi-automatic firearm out there, including what is typically used by the Boy Scouts for marksmanship training, versus just something that encompasses cosmetics on rifles like AR-15s or AK-47s. You'll also see some pushback on our preemption law. You'll see bills to allow libraries, localities to ban firearms in places like libraries or other public buildings and public parks. Those will probably be the easy lift that the Democrats think they can get. I don't think you're going to see as much of the overreach on ammunition background checks or things like that. I think they're going to go for what they think is possible first and then see where they can go from there. It's interesting. I was listening to a talk show here in Richmond this morning on WRVA, and while I don't really go along and subscribe to the description that was given that most of the Democrats in the General Assembly are moderate, it was interesting to hear that now they're going to have to deal with some of their factions, because clearly some of the ones that were elected last night are further to the left than most of the ones that have been in the General Assembly. Mm-hmm. And even people like Dick Faslaw from Fairfax, who is known to be totally anti-gun, he does have a reasonable streak in him, and he is one of those that may take pause at going too far at one time. And somebody else that really surprised me was Joe Morrissey this morning on that radio program. He said, we've got to be careful not to overreach. And knowing what stunt he pulled on the floor of the House of Delegates a number of years ago,
right,
it was really interesting to hear that. But part of that is driven by his personal story. He wasn't really the candidate that Democrats wanted for that Senate seat that he ran for. He beat an incumbent Democrat for that primary. And so I think he's going to be an independent streak. You'll see the Virginia Shooting Sports Association reaching out to folks like Chap Peterson, who's also a Democrat from Northern Virginia, who has been very supportive of concealed carry because I believe he has a concealed carry permit. And it's people like him that drove Terry McAuliffe to strike a deal to overturn Mark Herring's change in the reciprocity agreements that we had several years ago. So at VSSA, we're going to be trying to build more relationships like that to try to either stop legislation or at least substantially neuter it.
I think that's what you have to do here. Politics makes strange bedfellows, and in order to be effective, you've got to be able to work with those where you can find any sort of common ground, and that's just the nature of the political beast right now. I want to go back to the quote unquote assault weapons ban, the ban on semi-automatic long guns that Governor Ralph Northam had talked about. As you say, we don't know what version this is going to look like. The bill that Northam had backed contained a grandfather provision, right? So existing gun owners would have to register their firearms with the state of Virginia, supposedly register their magazines too. I don't even know how that would work, but then there would be no new sales allowed. I have heard, Dave, and I'm curious if you've heard this as well, that there are some in the legislature who would back a Beto style Mr. and Mrs. Virginia, turn them in and we'll give you some cash for the gun that we've banned.
I have not heard that. That doesn't mean it's not being discussed. And I think that's where you'll find some folks like Saslaw and others that might say, that's a step too far right now. That's where the relationship building will come, to find those Democrats that may not have been with us, that at the same time understand that they are only under this redistricting plan for this current election, and that even though they get to redraw the districts, they don't want to do anything that's going to cause them to have a backlash after one election.
Talking again with Dave Adams, Legislative Affairs Director for the Virginia Shooting Sports Association. All right. So, Dave, going back to this idea of talking to some of those Democrats that are now in the majority in the legislature, One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is the arguments that we make, and look, clearly with this crowd that's in charge now in Richmond, arguing that, look, this violates the Constitution of the United States, it violates people's individual right to keep bear arms. That's not necessarily a winning argument. They don't really seem to care, or they just say no, it doesn't. Right? What about pointing out things like the disparate impact that these gun laws are likely to have in the state of Virginia? We've got a lot of these folks who are now in the new majority who say that they are criminal justice reformers. They've talking about, legalizing marijuana and expunging records, and yet their policies, when it comes to gun control, would criminalize, legal behavior right now in the state of Virginia, and would lead, I believe, to the arrest and prosecution of a lot of young minority men in Richmond and the Virginia Beach area, Roanoke, for nonviolent possessory firearm offenses.
I think you make an excellent point there. Back in 2005, a member of the House of Delegates, former delegate Bill Janus, spoke to the annual meeting that we held, and he was telling us then, he was predicting then about the demographics change in Virginia and how we needed to reach out to more people and people that are different than what maybe were associated with being in the gun community at the time. You get other people have been saying, look at Mash Touré, or Black Guns Matter. You get, I think, the most compelling testimony we heard up on Capitol Hill when they were discussing the, quote, assault weapons ban was when Amy Swearer of the Heritage Foundation talked about her mom and what the type of firearm she was using at that time, trying to learn to shoot, how the AR-15 was much easier for her than some of the other firearms that she was trying to use. We need to involve more women and minorities who are gun owners. They need to be the ones that we put forward at the General Assembly to explain exactly what their situation is. I think the disparate impact, John Lott talks about this all the time with some of the background checks, and when in places like D.C. and Chicago, where you have to pay hundreds of dollars to get a permit to purchase a pistol, how much that impacts minorities who, in a lot of cases, are in need of that firearm more than others, low-income folks. So you make a perfect case there for how we need to make our outreach and our messaging different than what we've been doing in the past.
Dave Adams, listen, I know we'll be talking a lot over the coming months here. When does the legislative session kick in? And are you worried at all about any gun control laws passing during the lame duck session? Because lawmakers come back into Richmond, next week, right?
Yes, they do come back next week, and I don't know that you'll see anything passed. They might try to, if anything, you might see Delegate Gilbert's bill be discussed. Okay. Which had more to do with targeting criminals than you did targeting law-abiding gun owners. But that doesn't mean that some of those folks that are going out might not want to see something. I think the thing that had the most support in discussion was the so-called red flag laws. I think we all agree we don't want people who shouldn't have access to firearms to get a firearm. The problem is with red flag laws is that no one wants to talk about the canary in the mine, and that's the mental health part of that. Just taking the gun away from somebody who may be a danger to themselves doesn't stop them from possibly being a danger if you don't take the other steps that are necessary to help that person. No,
that's absolutely right. And, it's interesting because one of the things that I've seen, one of the set of statistics that's been used is gun-related suicides dropped by, I think it was 19% in Connecticut after the adoption of red flag laws, something like 14% reduction in gun-related suicides in Indiana. But if you actually look at the overall suicide rate, Dave, suicides increased by almost 20% overall in Connecticut during that same time period. And I believe went up by almost 30% in Indiana over that same rate. So, which is exactly to your point. We see somebody that's a danger to themselves or others. We take their legal guns away and we think that solves the problem. Absolutely not. If we are not willing to deal with that individual that we've declared to be a danger, what the hell are we doing? And so even beyond the due process concerns, the concerns that judges will simply rubber stamp these applications, because who wants to be the judge that lets somebody keep their guns and then they go off and do something to harm themselves or somebody else? There is the fact that this is a gun control bill that is sort of disguised as a mental health proposal. And it does absolutely nothing to help that individual in need. So I've got my objections from a constitutional perspective, but even from just a practical, does it do what it's supposed to do perspective, I think this proposal fails.
Oh, and I think that once again, this goes right back to what you mentioned about our messaging, is that when you start talking due process, people like you and I know what that's all about. But I'm not so sure that the average American, when you say due process, that it doesn't go right over their head.
Right.
But you start talking about the mental health part, or does it make sense to leave that person in a situation where they're not getting the help they may need just because you took the gun away? I think people understand that.
I think that they do as well. And it's my hope, anyway, that we've got some folks there in the legislature, maybe even some new officials who are at least willing to listen. I can't say I'm optimistic about it, but I do have hope. Dave, thank you as always, sir, for coming on the program. I know we'll be talking again very soon, and thanks for everything you do there here in the state of Virginia for gun owners. Do appreciate Dave joining us on the program. And I got to tell you, this fight is far from over in Virginia. I know that gun owners are feeling down today in the state of Virginia. And I think rightfully so. But you can't stay down. You do have to pick yourself up. We've got fights ahead. We've got legislative battles that will be fought. Gun owners are not going to roll over in the legislature just because there is a anti-gun majority in both the House and the Senate. I guarantee you that any bill that gets to Governor Ralph Northam's desk and is signed into law is likely to be challenged in court. But I think we are also likely to see things like the rise of Second Amendment sanctuary communities in the state of Virginia as well. And we'll be covering that in much more detail in the weeks and months ahead here on Bearing Arms, Cam and Company. But the fight does continue. But again, if you're a gun owner outside of Virginia, why does this matter? Because this strategy on the part of gun control advocates will be replicated in states across the nation in 2020. They will go in, not only spending tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars trying to defeat Donald Trump, but they will be targeting local elections. They'll be targeting city council races, state reps, state senators. And they'll be flooding these suburban districts with cash. They'll be portraying opponents of gun control legislation as cold, uncaring, heartless individuals in the pocket of the gun lobby, even though, by the way, they're outspending the quote-unquote gun lobby 7, 8, 10 to 1. Now, gun owners, I do believe, and Second Amendment supporters, I do believe can be effective in pushing back on this narrative. But we got to be smart about it. We've got to be unified. We have to have as broad a coalition as we possibly can. And we'll be talking a lot about that in the weeks and months ahead as well. All right, let's get to today's Armed Citizen story, our good deed of the day, as well as our recidivist report. This one from Cincinnati, Ohio, where a 15-year-old is going to be facing murder charges as a juvenile, not as an adult, despite what prosecutors had asked. Now, as it turns out, this 15-year-old was not actually the one who pulled the trigger, but prosecutors say he was an accomplice to this death. The 15-year-old, along with his buddy, a young man named Jordan Lara, decided that they're going to rob a woman back in June. And the woman was armed herself. And so when Laura pointed a gun at the woman drew her own firearm, shot back. Laura was critically injured, died a couple of days later. Prosecutors wanted this 15-year-old to face charges of homicide as an adult because he too was armed. He did not point his gun at the woman, but he was armed at the time. And he was no stranger to the criminal justice system. He was already on probation at the time of this attempted armed robbery. Instead, Judge John Williams in Hamilton County, Ohio, decided to bind this 15-year-old over to juvenile court, which means that he will face very little time behind bars, even if convicted of the murder of his accomplice. Now, our armed citizen story for you from New York State. So Virginia gun owners take heart. Even in New York State with the SAFE Act, you still have people who are acting in self-defense. Home invasion in Genesee County, and the undersheriff in that case says a stranger burst into a home. It was about 9 p.m. Tuesday night. He was armed. Homeowner was armed as well. Fired a shot with what's described as a long gun. Don't know what kind. And the suspect injured, life-flighted to a hospital in Rochester, New York. The investigation continues. Don't have a lot of details here, but this does look like a case of self-defense there in the town of Stafford, New York. And finally, we've got our good deed of the day for you. I love this story. Marietta, Georgia. These two gentlemen met for the first time back in 2015. Justin Jackson and Sean Rohan. Actually, Sean Rohan arrested Justin Jackson back in 2015. Officer Rohan is with the Marietta, Georgia Police Department. Justin Jackson, a lifelong drug addict at the time, and had been arrested multiple times before. And this time, when he got arrested, he said things were a little bit different. He said it wasn't the tackle and tasing that I was used to. It was a little bit more compassionate. Well, it turns out Officer Rohan's brother had died because of his addiction just a couple of weeks earlier. And Sean Rohan ended up talking to Justin Jackson about that. And he said, there are consequences. This is what could happen to you if you don't make a change in your life. And it stuck. It stuck with Justin Jackson. It was the moment that he started to get his stuff together and started to turn his life around. And now in 2019, he helps manage a recovery center called The Zone in Marietta, Georgia. And Fox 5 in Atlanta says he never knew the name of the officer that arrested him and that talked to him. He always wanted to meet him, and they had a chance. He said, it's a unique blessing for me that I can put the person to that event. Officer Rohan says it's great to hear what he's done and the recovery that he's made and the people that he helps now in the position that he is in. So I got to tell you, we got a couple of good deeds here. Obviously, Officer Sean Rohan for speaking that truth to Justin Jackson. Justin Jackson turning his life around, helping others out now in the right place at the right time, willing and able to do the right thing. Gentlemen, we thank you both for your good deeds. And that is going to do it for this edition of Bearing Arms Cam and Company. I'm going to go to a gun store in Virginia, see how crowded it is. Be talking to my local lawmakers and making some other phone calls to make sure that gun owners have not given up the fight here in the Old Dominion. Thank you for being a part of the program today. Hey, don't forget to check out the new VIP experience at Bearing Arms. We've got a whole post that'll let you know about all of the new tiers where you can get an ad-free experience, some exclusive content, some sneak peeks at some of the content populating the website. It's a fantastic new addition, and I hope that you will be a part of it and help support Bearing Arms Cam and Company and Bearing Arms itself. Thank you so much again for being a part of the program. Don't forget you can subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, townhall.com's podcast page. Also subscribe to Town Hall Media on YouTube. We'll be back tomorrow with more of the latest Second Amendment news and information.